I am going to simply start by saying that the mission of the Bibliophile podcast is to explore and understand the roles of players that are active in the realm of book culture. And today it's the literary critic. Daniel Mendelsohn is a highly regarded practitioner who has agreed to share his knowledge of the subject with us. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us.
Sure, my pleasure.
Perhaps we could start with who you are.
Do you care to elaborate on that question? It has many answers, and literary critic is actually just one of them.
Yes, well, should our listeners know anything about you before what you're going to say?
Well, I started writing professionally in the late 1980s, actually, while I was still in the middle of a dissertation in classics at Princeton University. I started submitting reviews and review essays to different publications while I was still in grad school. I had always been very attracted to the world of criticism. I read a tremendous amount of popular criticism. I'm not talking about scholarly or academic criticism. I mean, reviews in the New Yorker, the New York Times, publications my parents subscribed to. And I was very enthralled by critics and what they did from my teenage years. So while I was in grad school, I started writing book and movie reviews for the Princeton University student newspaper. And at a certain point, my editor, who was an undergraduate, I was a graduate student, said, people will pay you to do this. And I looked at her with great astonishment. Now, this is in the late 80s, and when sort of magazine and print culture was still reigning supreme. I think it's important to recall that because one could actually make a living out of doing this, as amazing as that may now sound. So I started submitting things while I was still in grad school, and I started to build a little career. And by the time I finished my Ph.D., I decided that I was going to leave academia and just write. Now, I do other kinds of writing, as you know, but I was very much interested in trying to make a substantial career out of writing different kinds of criticism. And so I started writing for The Nation. I started writing for the Village Voice. And so the day after graduation, I moved to the city and I just started freelancing. With it, things worked out well for me. And I was in fairly short order writing for the New York Times Book Review. And that gave me a platform starting in the mid-1990s. And then by 2000, I was writing very regularly for the New York Review of Books, which became my home publication, really. I also started writing for the New Yorker, but it was primarily the New York Review of Books that gave me a platform to write very long, 4 or 5, even 6,000 word long review essays. And that has been my home ever since. And as you know, a couple of years ago, I became the editor at large of that publication, which I now represent in different ways. So I think it's important to rehearse that history because I've never seen criticism as a day job that funds my quote unquote creative writing, which I also do. But I see it as a fully fledged and full-blooded literary pursuit in itself, and I take it very seriously. And I am constantly agitating for people to remember that, writing criticism is not an ancillary or parasitic activity. It is a literary endeavor in itself. And in fact, since the death of Bob Silvers, the founding editor of the New York Review of Books, he named me to head a charitable foundation that he endowed in his will to support writers of precisely this kind of writing that I myself and a number of other people do as their primary form of expression.
Yeah, it's troubling that people can't make a living doing this anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's been hard. I mean, between the advent of the internet, which has suddenly exploded both the number and the kind of platforms available to huge numbers of people to sort of weigh in on critical matters, and the disappearance of what had been very well established and very long-lived platforms in print media for reviewers. And I'm not just talking about book criticism here, although I know, Nigel, that that's what we're interested in today. I'm talking about film criticism, drama criticism, television criticism. All these things have been shrunk. And so there has been a radical shift, even in the relatively short amount of time that I've been writing professionally as a critic, which is to say, let's say since 1988, which I think is the first time I ever got paid to write an article. There are many more critical voices, one might say, which encompasses everything from people like me to people who write Goodreads or Amazon reviews. But obviously, there aren't as many gatekeepers as there used to be, in the sense of, official platforms. One used to look out for the Chicago Tribune review, the Los Angeles Times review. And as we know, particularly book supplements, Sunday book supplements, which used to be a great source of literary information, evaluation, judgment, activity, have all but vanished, and the few that are left are hanging on by a thread. And that naturally affects two things. It affects the discourse, there are fewer professionals weighing in, and it affects the ability of people like me to, make a living of this. The idea of the professional critic is quite endangered by now. Now, look, you can say, well, look, this is democracy in action. Now everybody gets to say what they think. And to a certain extent, I think that's been a good thing. Things like Goodreads, I think, as an author myself, because you always have to remember, I sit on both sides of this fence. As an author myself, it's always interesting to see what ordinary readers, quote unquote, and I use that in the technical sense of the term, which means intelligent readers who are not professionally invested in this activity. It's always interesting to see what ordinary readers have to say about one's book. But that is not the same as knowing what a professional thinks, a person who has spent their life thinking about literature, studying literature, and of necessity just knowing more about literature than the average bear, and to me that makes a big difference. The lack of many venues for rigorous professional criticism obviously makes a difference to the discourse overall. George W.S. Trout has a great phrase about what one used to want from the institution, the public publishing institutions that one grew up with, the old New Yorker, the old New York Times, and he called it adult wisdom. And I love that term. And that's what one used to get. Look, it wasn't perfect, and there were a lot of jerks, and there were a lot of people who were not good at this, I can think of literary prizes named after people who weren't particularly good at the thing the prizes are given for. But the fact remains that overall, the idea that there was a class of people whose job it was to do this, who had studied, I'm sure Ike tomorrow could start the Daniel Mendelsohn Open Heart Surgery blog, where I can publish my opinions about what I think open heart surgery is all about. But at the end of the day, you want to talk to a heart surgeon. And by the same token, a literary critic, a professional critic, can give you something that even the most intelligent non-specialist book blogger or Goodreads reviewer isn't going to be able. It's not, and I'm not saying that to sort of smash or rule out the importance of that kind of discourse. I'm just saying that discourse makes more sense when it hangs in a kind of balance with professional discourse. And it's the lopsided proportion that's worrying me right now, especially in a culture in which expertise is now, a sort of a roiling emotion.
Well, isn't it capitalism in part that's to blame?
How so?
Well, publications can't make money publishing professional critics' commentary.
I don't know. I mean, look, whatever I say on this subject, Nigel, I have to say I'm speaking, as a complete amateur. I'm no great expert on the industry in all of its economic expressions, but that could be the case. I mean, look, cultures evolve, media evolve. I'm a classicist. I have a very long view about these things. Things disappear that we thought would last forever. And yes, to some extent, it's obvious that newspapers aren't making money from their book sections. Notoriously, the ads in the book section, the Sunday book supplement, aren't paying for anything, and they're shrinking. There's that. Yeah. But I also believe that people will. I think it's also it's not only a bottom-up model, what the public wants or whatever. It's also there. You could also say it's a top-down thing. If you give people good things to read, they'll read it. People are no stupider or smarter now than they were in 1950 when the New Yorker regularly published 9,000-word book reviews. So what has changed? It's not the intelligence level of the audience. It's what people are told or are expecting to do at their time.
Okay.
And now you look at a magazine, even respectable magazines like the New Yorker, and you log on the website and it tells you how long it's going to take to read an article. And I always thought, really, you're so busy that you're worried about how many seconds it's going to take to read a book review? Your time is so precious. You need that much time to take pictures of your food to put on your Instagram account? I mean, be serious. So, we live in a culture that it's not conducive to slow, reflective reading activity the way people used to expect was the case. There are, as we all know, and I'm not exempt from this, and nor are you, I'm sure, there are many more claims on our daily time. There are many more intrusions. There are many more distractions. So a certain kind of reading is no longer possible for me and you, let alone people who aren't professionally interested in books and book reviewing. That's just the way it is. So I can't answer the question of, is it capitalism? Is it culture? How they work together. Obviously they do work together, but I can just say it's unfortunate that if you were raised in a certain culture as a reader of a certain kind of text, in periodicals, long, thoughtful book reviews, Pauline Kael going on for 7,000 words about the latest Brian De Palma movie. I just regret that that's not possible, because at the end of the day, you have to express a value, and the value is the more thoughtful people are, the better they'll be.
Incidentally, Pauline Kael didn't convince you about Brian De Palma.
I actually like Brian De Palma. I don't necessarily think he's, the greatest thing since sliced bread, but Pauline Kael is a great, I always use her as a model of many things, but most importantly of the fact that a critic can be very good even when they're totally wrong. Being right, as I get older, seems to me less and less important. I think the thing is to be interesting.
Okay, so who are you? You are an interesting, passionate, professional book critic. Is that good?
I'll accept the compliment.
Okay. So I'd just like to get on the record what it is that a professional book critic does. I'll just take a stab at it. There's a lot here. And then I want to move into a specific question about something you said in a conversation with James Wood that I really enjoyed. It was about a year ago through the Harvard bookstore. So anyway, what do? They are those who read, study, evaluate, and analyze, explain, teach, pass judgment, and opine on in various mediums books. novels, plays, poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and inevitably by evaluating the content, also on art, society, politics, religion, life, death, emotions, illness, whatever the book deals with, plus word choice, syntax, grammar, diction, plot structures, character depiction, and on the book as an object itself.
That sounds right.
You good with that?
I'm good with all that. Yeah.
So in your conversation with James Wood, the most moving, interesting part I found was when you talked about the coincidences that occurred while you were researching your book, The Lost. And I've experienced some amazing coincidences around books. And it seems to me that the more you know, and this gets to T.S. Eliot talking about how good critics are intelligent,
right?
The more coincidences occur. And the critic's job is to point out coincidences or connections. And just before I turn that over to you, I'd like to quote from Lewis Hyde's The Gift, in which he says, "An artist who wishes to exercise the power of imagination must submit himself to what I shall be calling a gifted state, one in which he is able to discern connections inherent in his materials and give the increase, bring the work to life. The artist who succeeds in this endeavor has realized his gift. He has made it real, made it a thing. Its spirit is embodied in the work." And just finally, sometimes then, if we are awake, if the artist really was gifted, the work will induce a moment of grace, a communion, a period during which we too know the hidden coherence of our being and feel the fullness of our lives.
Okay.
Can you process that for me?
Off the cuff, as a description of what it feels like to encounter a genuine work of literature and art, I think it hits the nail on the head. The sense of a sense of communion. And I like very much, the way that ends with a sense that one has a deeper sense of one's own life by participating in a work of art, I think is always a marker of when you come away from something that's truly great, and we all recognize it. And we all know what that feels like. When you close a book that is genuinely great, you feel that not only do you appreciate its qualities, but it's almost irresistible not to then import the experience, the insights, the sense of wonder and admiration into one's own life and make you think in a different way about the way you lead your own life. I mean, I think to me that's part of the definition of a really great work of art, and may not be part of the definition of a really good work of art, which you can admire and enjoy, and those are all good things. But, a really great work makes you rethink your life. It's like the end of that famous Rilke poem about the broken Greek statue, the archaic torso of Apollo, where you're looking at this beautiful but broken object from another civilization. And the last line of the poem is, "Du musst dein Leben ändern." You have to change your life. That's what a great work of art makes you think. It has life impact. So I think that's a wonderful, I hope you'll share that with me later. It'd be very useful to read that to students, for example. But yes, and I think that literary critics, or actually all critics, because as you know, I write about not just books, but many other things, film and television and theater, are what literary criticism tries to do is surgically, as it were, to perform an autopsy on a work and lay it bare and show you how it works, why it didn't work, and why it should or should not have worked. I always say there's 3 questions that you need to be asking as a critic. What did this thing think it was doing? How well did it do it? And was it worth doing in the first place? Which requires, a high degree of, as they say, judginess, but judginess is what our business is. But I do think that, so the work of the critic mediates between the work, the text, the movie, the TV series, whatever, and the audience in a way that will help, hopefully, the audience understand its own reactions to the work as mediated through the reactions of the critic. Now, when you like a critic and you find yourself agreeing with that person more often than not, then there's a kind of companionable feel to the process. You feel like you're walking out of the movie with a friend and discussing it and realizing why it's as good as you thought it was, or realizing why it's as stinky as you thought it was. And when you're in the company of a critic that you don't like, or whose opinions you find rebarbative or disagree with, it can be just as illuminating, because it still clarifies your reaction, which is what criticism should do. I would say in one phrase, that's what good criticism helps us to do. It helps clarify our reactions to a work of art. Quite often, precisely in the way, Nigel, that the quote that you just read illuminates, when we encounter a work that we respond to, it's very emotional. You use these words, grace, these are intangible and ineffable responses, but the critic can't afford to be ineffable and intangible. The critic's job is to articulate, and tease apart these deep but often opaque reactions we have to a work. So the critic's job, as I say, is a kind of autopsy. You peel away the skin, you peel away the fat, you peel away the muscles to see how is it put together, and why does it make us feel the way that we do? That, to me, is one of the distinctions between criticism and opinion. Everyone has an opinion, which is fine. Everyone should have an opinion. It's the sign of an active mind. But a piece of criticism cannot be what an opinion often is, which is, oh, I loved it, or it made me feel great, or it made me think of my mother, or, those are great, but they're not helpful. They don't clarify your response. The critic has to go behind the reaction, even his or her own reaction, and figure out what makes it tick. Because honestly, if I'm going to buy a copy of the New Yorker for $8.99 or however much it costs now, $15.99, who knows, then I want help. I don't want to just see Anthony Lane saying, oh, I love the James Bond movie. That's not what I'm paying for. I have a great friend who's been a great mentor to me in publishing, Bob Gottlieb, who actually used to be the editor of the New Yorker. And was a great mentor to me when I first started writing. And he always used to joke, but not joking, really. He was quite serious. He would always say, criticism is a service industry. You are helping your reader understand and articulate what makes this movie or play or TV show or book the way it is. Why does it have the effect on you that it has, or doesn't have the effect that it thinks it's having? So it's something you're doing for the reader.
You mentioned the feeling that you get when you're in the presence of a great work of art, the feeling that somehow, because of it, you want to change your life, correct?
Yeah.
Years ago, I made the point that the reason that I loved War and Peace so much was that it gave me advice on how to live my life. And boy, did I get shit on for that.
Well, I think it depends, how one takes that phrase, you must change your life. I mean, when I read War and Peace, undeniably a very great work of art, and I say, oh, it makes you want to change your life. I don't mean, it doesn't make you want to dress up as Napoleon and invade Russia. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah, don't invade Russia. No one should invade Russia.
Right, exactly. That's a life lesson that you get from reading War and Peace. Don't invade Russia. Yeah. No, but I mean, in the sense that it makes you want to think more deeply about the workings of life. Right. War and Peace makes you think a lot about, for example, among many other things, the relationship between the individual and history. How do people act as historical actors? Where is the territory between the personal and the public? Those are things that you think about. And, sometimes, so it makes you want to change your life, not in like, oh, I'm going to quit my job and now, study Russian history, but the insights that you have into human behavior that you get from a great work of art, and great works of art do give you that, should at least make you want to think about your own life more deeply. That's what literature does. It should make you want to think more deeply. And that's what I mean when I say change your life, not in some superficial surface way, but to think about the way you act in your own life. And it's not necessarily, I just want to add in finishing this thought, it's not, because I encounter this a lot with students and I always try to steer them away from this kind of thinking. It's not about a lesson. Literature doesn't give you life lessons the way how to or self-help books. It's just about being more reflective. And as I said before, if you're a person like me, who thinks that you will have a better life if it's more reflective, if you reflect more on what you do, then literature is an important tool for helping you to be able to do that. And therefore, criticism is an important tool because criticism helps you understand how literature does what it does. So it's a further or even meta form of reflection.
And so why is reflecting on your own life better than not reflecting on it?
I can only quote here, the unexamined life is not worth living.
It's not an answer.
It seems self-evident to me that it's more, maybe it's only true for a certain kind of person, but presumably the kind of people who are listening to a literature podcast is already that kind of person. The more you think about things, the more you get out of them. It allows you to be an actor in life in a way that otherwise you would just be passive, it seems to me. To be the object of energies and circumstances whose meaning and import you don't understand seems to me not to be a state that you want to be in. But maybe you do. I don't know.
And yet someone like Napoleon, he just barreled out and did a whole bunch of things. I mean, maybe he was reflective, but
well, I don't know enough about Napoleon, but I'm not sure I'm going to want to draw a paradigm that says reflective people are not doers. I mean, Winston Churchill was a reflective person. So was Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, I think that becomes a little too schematic. I think one could find examples both of doers who were unreflective and doers who were reflective.
Okay. Oscar Wilde saw critics as participants in art who, through their criticism, reshaped or added to works of art in ways not necessarily intended by their creators. You agree with that?
I think it can be the case. I don't think it's necessarily the case, but it certainly can be the case that, again, I think people like to think of criticism as, let's say, parasitic on a work of art. But if you think of criticism as a conversation with a work of art, I think it's a more helpful way to think of it. And in that, if you accept that metaphor, then it is part of the work. Just as you can't have a conversation with one person, that it's discursive. One of the critics that I read very deeply and very admiringly, and still do, when I was first becoming a critic, published critic myself in the early 90s, was Arthur Danto, the art critic for The Nation.
Yeah.
And I was always astounded by the way that, there would be some show and I would go into the city and look at the paintings and respond however I respond as a person who knows nothing about art. And then I would go read his essay about it the next week in The Nation and just be gratified and astounded about the things that he had suddenly illuminated that I would never have guessed. So to me, I think that criticism is so deeply part of a conversation that you have with a work. And I like to use that metaphor, the conversation. So it becomes hard for me, for example, to look at Jasper Johns, of whom there was a huge retrospective going on, without filtering it to some extent through Arthur Danto, the art critic who first taught me how to look at Jasper John, which is not to say that it's inextricable or that I only see it the way that Arthur Danto saw it, but that it's a kind of it's like opening a door, and behind the door there's another door, and there's a corridor of doors, and you can keep going through each one, and each one of those doors is an interesting critic telling you something about the work. It doesn't necessarily end. And for that, I'm grateful. And that's what I want from a critic. And even when I disagree with critics, as I, jokingly referred to at the beginning of our conversation, sometimes there are critics that you disagree with very often, if not most of the time, and you still get something out of that because it at least sharpens your own response. If you're going to disagree with Pauline Kael about the value of Brian De Palma, you are thereby forced to articulate in a very precise way, because she's very precise, what it is you think about Brian De Palma and why she's wrong. So it can only be good. This, I think one of the problems or one of the dangers of the current stratum of the culture, which is ranking, everything happens 3 stars, 2 stars, thumbs up, likes, dislikes, all of that, is it can't be part of a conversation. It's not discursive. This business of giving stars to things, it's so idiotic. On the one hand, maybe not. If people want to know, should they go to the movie or not? Okay, fine. If it has 5 stars, they'll go. And if it has 1 star, they may not go. Or Rotten Tomatoes or, whatever. But that's not the kind of criticism we're talking about here, And so sometimes some of the critics I read the most often are people that I'm constantly not agreeing with, because I feel it's such a vivifying.
It's stimulating.
Yeah. My great friend, Rick Brody, who's the film critic, one of the film critics for The New Yorker, whom I've known since I was a teenager. He was a friend of my older brother at college. I don't almost never agree with him about movies, but I always read him, because I think he's making me smarter about movies, because he's forcing me to articulate what I think.
Well, the other thing is that conversations aren't necessarily that interesting unless there's a certain degree of disagreement.
Yeah. It's like when God knows, we've all lived through lots of Zoom panels over the past year and a half, almost 2 years. And, there's nothing more boring than when everyone agrees with each other. You need that traction. Look, this opens up for me a different conversation about criticism, which is, one's own practice. For me, the trigger for writing a piece is the sense of that traction, of something not working, of something that's rubbing me the wrong way, or that I haven't figured out yet. It's like the princess and the pea. You need to feel that little discomfort. For me, I'm not saying this is true of every critic, but what makes me tick as a critic is when I feel like there's something I haven't figured out. This is irrespective of whether I like the thing or not, but something that I haven't figured out. And for me, writing the piece is the way of figuring it out. So I think that sense of traction, discord, difficulty can be very fruitful in the actual writing of a piece of criticism for me.
Okay, I think the reason that you admire critics is that you learn from them.
Yeah.
And I'm referring to the manifesto you wrote in 2012 in the New Yorker.
Mm.
And you said the review could be half over before he got around to talking about the performance under review. But by this point, by the time he described what he'd seen on stage, you, the reader, had the background necessary to appreciate or deprecate the performance as he had described it.
Yeah, Andrew Porter is who I was talking about. I think I was referring to a review of an opera by Michael Tippett, whom he used to champion. Yeah, I mean, look, I do that myself now. I sort of model a way that I do these long essays on the Andrew Porter model, which is you have to give your reader, again, it's a service industry. So in a certain long kind of piece where you have the space to do this, give people the background of the work, how it came to be. You know, I remember writing a piece for the New York Review, a book about a new opera production, actually, that being one of the things I like to write about, a review of a new production at the Metropolitan Opera of Lucia de Lammermoor. And, you know, I took time to rehearse the history of the opera, why it was created, how it's an adaptation of a Walter Scott novel, how the adaptation changed the original, all these things, because then by the time you get to the halfway point and you're describing the performer, the performance itself, the singing, the staging, the set, the production, people have something to stand on. They can evaluate this in a very special way. And I think criticism is educational. Look, there's a reason I'm a critic and I'm also a teacher. And to me, they're very entwined. You know, it's not, you know, I think people have a wrong idea, or maybe an idea that's formed from the wrong people sometimes, you know, that criticism is about ramming your opinion down other people's throats. And I don't think that's what it's about. I think it's about, you know, you come out of the movie or you finish the book and you want to share your response. And because you're being paid to do this, you have the time, or should take the time, to do the research, know the background, read the other books by that novelist or whatever, and help create a context for the reader that allows them not only to judge the work, but to judge your judgment of the work, actually.
And I think that's the concern, isn't it? Is that today critics aren't being adequately paid to do all of that kind of background research and present it.
Right. You know, so look, I'm lucky. I basically, for 25 years, have been writing for the same 3 publications, and they give me space and they give me what I need. You know, I am deeply aware that that's not necessarily typical even of other professional critics. You know, I mean, look, when I started out scrambling and freelancing, you know, you wrote what you could, where you could, just hoping to get paid. And if it was 500-word book review, you were happy. So I'm not ignorant of the fact that my circumstances are special in being able to write the kind of stuff that I write. I'm fortunate.
The kind of community of intelligent citizens it's important to have people like you presenting this kind of material so that they can all evaluate something in common.
Right. That's what I think. And that's why I think it's a kind of writing that ought to be supported, you know. But again, now we're back to our question of capitalism. I can't make that happen. But, you know, I think what we are agreeing that it is in fact a useful enterprise.
Yes. Speaking of community, I love what you say about Pauline Kael. First of all, you say that she wrote the way that most people talked. And then you said that the way she wrote made you feel included and, quote, made me want to be smart enough to deserve that inclusion.
Yeah, perhaps because through my whole life, starting when I was a very young child, I had very good teachers I don't ever resent being taught. I don't resent the fact that there are people who know more than I do, and I should listen to them when they talk. That may be an outmoded model right now. I suspect it might be. You know, I always felt that when you were reading someone like Andrew Porter in the New Yorker, or Pauline Kael, or any number of deeply distinguished critics, you know, I wanted to feel like I should work to be included in the circle of people they were addressing, and instead of telling them that they should speak in words of one syllable so I could understand them. You know, again, it's communal or commutative. You know, there's something commutational about it. You know, the critic offers a certain discourse at a certain level, and the expectation that an interested reader will want to engage at that level. You know,
I think too, you touch on it. There's also this, when you read it, there's this motivation to understand. There's this motivation to know what the critic's talking about. And if you don't get it, then to go out and learn more.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to me to be self-evident, you know, that's your job as a reader. You know, that to be a reader is not equal to being passive. It means, especially if you're going to take the time to read a long article about something, then you got to do your homework too.
Yeah, yeah. What you say is in this manifesto again is what I was really learning from these critics each week was how to think critically, how to judge things for myself. To think is to make judgment based on knowledge, period.
Yeah. Because the best criticism is very rigorous. It's, you make an argument. I mean, even though, look, there's a certain amount of smoke and mirrors with criticism, which is, at the end of the day, it's subjective to a certain extent. How one reacts to a work of art is ultimately a function of your personality, your taste, your temperament, all these intangibles. That said, when you present it to a public as a piece of criticism, you have to craft an argument. You know, you have to, if you say that the movie was slowly paced, you have to give examples of that. You have to support what you say. So it's an essentially subjective undertaking that has to pass itself off as, or at least use the structures of, a highly rigorous objective argument. And to follow a scrupulous argument is to learn. And I always learn. And that's what I mean by getting smarter. You know, when I read critics I admire, I feel like I've learned something. To this day, I mean, I'm reading James for years now, James Wood. You know, I always feel I learned something in each of his pieces because of the depth and sensitivity of his observations. And that is a muscle you never stop exercising. It's not like you get to be 60 and you're there. You know, you never stop improving. It was funny, I was having a conversation with a younger critic on Twitter, which is how you and I know each other, one of the ways. And I was saying I was just going through the essays of V.S. Pritchett and how I felt, you know, reading these essays last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, it made me want to be smarter and to write better. And this young critic said, oh my God, well, if Daniel Mendelsohn is saying that, and I said, honey, it never stops. You don't stop.
Well, it's self-doubt, isn't it?
So,
Doubt's important.
Well, partly, but you know, I mean, you never stop being educable. You never, hopefully, you know, I feel the way I've always felt, which is that there's still an amazing amount to learn. And these people are helping me learn at the age of 61, just as it was true when I was 31.
Speaking of James Wood, his use of metaphors equals many great writers of the day, I think. I've got it in the notes further down here somewhere, but I do want to jump into it. In a way, there is a level of comparison, obviously, in criticism. It's a bit like a metaphor. This is what James says in his book, Selected Essays, Serious Noticing.
Right.
He ends off his introduction with, listen, I have to play it for you on the piano. So in other words, I need to show you why this is so good. I want you to listen to this. I want you to understand why I think it's so good. I want to play it for you.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a great metaphor. I was very struck by that in reading that book, the sitting at the piano. I mean, to me, the salient point here is, that criticism, again, is a literary activity, and a lot of the people who do it are wonderful writers in their own right. They have style, they have verb, they have everything that you want from writing. I mean, reading good criticism is as satisfying to me as reading a good novel or any other kind of work. I mean, I do think, particularly in the States, and maybe in North America in general, there's such a prejudice that, literature only consists of the novel and everything else is somehow, well, look at how we describe literature. There's fiction, and then there's everything else, nonfiction, which is such a stupid category. It doesn't mean anything, right? There's the novel and there's everything else. So I think people like James and others, remind us that the writing of criticism can be great writing, like any kind of great writing, and it's a deeply literary undertaking.
Yes, and the critic is an artist.
Yeah, as Wilde
kept
trying to say.
Yes. I guess the other thing that's fascinating and important about the critic is that they're able to judge when new stuff shows up. I mean, that's a big part of it, isn't it? It's so how do we make sense of this new thing here? Is it good or is it bad? Or, is it deep? Is it shallow?
Well, that's the hardest part. Very few people are right at the time that something happened.
Yes.
You look at early reviews of Proust, who couldn't even find a publisher, let's remember.
He paid
that
for
to
it.
me is the most admirable kind of critic, who instantly understands the value of something that actually turns out to be valuable. When you look, for example, if you read Axel Castle,
yes.
Edmund Wilson's early collection, what's striking about it is that at the moment that Proust was happening, at the moment that James Joyce was happening, he instantly understood the significance of this and rewarded it. Yeah, so that to me, and that's an extra faculty. I mean, one has to have a vast reserve, not only of knowledge and expertise, but of just native taste and kind of intuition to know that something is authentically worthwhile. And that it's very hard, I think, probably especially now when we live in this sort of maelstrom of PR and cutesy interventions by authors with their public. And, it's that much harder to sort of separate out the noise from the music, so to speak. But I have nothing but respect for people who can really recognize when something is the thing.
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to quote Clive James on Edmund Wilson. He says, what needs to be appreciated throughout Wilson's literary chronicles is the steady work of reporting, judging, sorting out, encouraging, reproving, and re-estimating. The three literary chronicles are, among other things, shattering reminders that many of the men we distinguish with the name of critic have never judged a piece of writing in their lives, just elaborated on judgments already formed by other.
Right.
He says.
Right. So, it goes to an important part of being a critic, and maybe the hardest part of being a critic, which is sticking to one's convictions, in the face of the very powerful force of either public opinion or the prevalent critical reception of a work. It's very hard to go against the grain, particularly now when we interact with our readers not only in the pages of the publications we write for, but on Twitter, on social media. People push back. There are, firestorms on social media. It's that much harder to just be independent minded and to resist the allure of the bandwagon. And, sometimes it's very difficult, and it's not, as I know from personal experience, it's not pleasant necessarily to be the only one saying that some much touted movie or book has no clothes, the emperor has no clothes. And, only time will tell.
This is one way of putting it. The serious critic ultimately loves his subject more than he loves his reader.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, that's the quote from my piece, and I believe it. I mean, the reason you write book criticism is not because you want to be popular and not because you want Twitter followers. It's because you love literature, and the standards that you're judging a work of literature by are the standards that you have evolved through years of reading and thinking about literature. And that's ultimately what you have to serve. Because if you serve the public taste, you'll always be screwed, because public taste is fickle. So you're not going to get anything out of it except for some, brief, ephemeral ego stroking. But you have to stick to your guns, because that's the only thing you've got in this game. It's your own standards and your own convictions. And if everyone writes you angry emails, then that's the price you pay.
Well, it's also, isn't it? It's about choice of subject. You will review something either negatively or positively, but it's the mere fact that you find this piece, this book, or whatever it is, worthy of examination and analysis.
Well, that's what I feel. And as you know, I've not so much my book reviewing, but in my other criticism, I'm very happy to look at popular culture as well as high culture. But I always feel if something has a claim to being serious, then I'm perfectly happy to take it seriously. But then the bargain is made. You want to be taken seriously? Then the standards that are going to apply are serious standards. And that's true if I'm looking at the Spider-Man musical or Game of Thrones or Mad Men or whatever. You want to pretend you're being serious? Fine. But then you're going to be subject to very rigorous standards. And that's the name of the game. I think, to use Game of Thrones as an example, because I was writing about the hugely popular TV series, I read all the novels and I thought they were really kind of wonderful, actually. I mean, I think you have to be open-minded. One thing I will say, because you said you mentioned the choice of subject, it's never been the case. And I know people won't believe this because the way that certain reviews turned out, but everything that I write about, I have no preconceived opinion about. I don't review something because I want to do a takedown of something that everyone else loved, although I have ended up doing that. Things that I famously, sort of didn't like, I had no notion about when I agreed to write the piece. For example, Mad Men, which I'd just been hearing about for so long. And Bob Silver said, we really need to do a piece about this because it's a cultural phenomenon. I said, oh, okay. And I started watching it. And after 3 episodes, I thought, I'm not feeling the love. But I don't think you can go into a piece with a preconceived notion of what you're going to say. You have to enter into things openly.
And it's not that easy to talk about loving literature per se. Sometimes I get angry at all of the positive reviews a work that doesn't deserve it gets.
But I don't know if it deserves it till I've read it.
Of course.
There will be some novel that everyone's talking about. And at that point you think, oh, let's see what this is about. Look, this happened. I actually just had to talk about this in a different context when that Hanya Yanagihara book came out, A Little Life, which I loathed, unlike most people, But the reason I reviewed it is because a young critic whom I admired had written a piece about it saying it was the first great gay novel of the 21st century. And I thought, wow, okay, let's see what this is about. And then I ended up hating it. But I think it's very unhealthy to enter into a work of criticism or the act of criticism when you think before you've even opened the book that you know what you're going to say. Because then you can't do what you're supposed to do. Then you can't serve your reader. And I know a lot of people don't believe this, but I think you really can't enter into the conversation when you think you know what the answer is, because then it's not a conversation, it's a setup.
Yeah. Okay, just winding down here. We've looked at who you are, what you do, and how you do it. You think we've covered off how you do it effectively?
Well, I mean, I do criticism. As I've said, I come from an academic, scholarly background originally, and so how do I do it? If I'm reviewing a novel, I read everything else that the person wrote. I do a lot of secondary reading about the person. I immerse myself. I mean, typically, when I start actually writing a piece, I'll have between 50 and 100 pages of notes.
Wow.
That's not that you necessarily feel all of that in the piece, or I mention everything I know in the piece, but that cushion of research and reflection is what I need to be sitting on when I'm writing. It makes me feel like I can speak with some kind of authority about the work. Again, that's if I'm writing one of these very long review essays. I'm not going to do that for a 500-page, 500-word squib. But that's my process. A lot of research, a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, and sometimes you just have to sit for a couple of weeks and process your own reaction. And then you sit down and write. I tend to do my first drafts in one day, even for very long pieces. I feel it's important to sort of feel the arc of my own thought, and then I can go back and start fiddling with things. But I even for a 6,000-word piece, I'll try to make a lot of coffee in the morning and come out bruised and battered at 11 o'clock at night. But I'm not one of those people who can write piecemeal, because the flow is very important to how it comes out. Because I think part of the interest of an interesting piece of criticism is that the piece itself is kind of showing you the drama of how the critic arrives at their conclusion. So that's
in fact, the way you sculpt it, holding the reader's attention, getting it and keeping it, seems to me the fundamental task of any writer. And if that doesn't happen,
the critic faces the same problem as any other kind of writer does. The novelist, the short story writer, which is getting your attention and holding on to it to the bitter end.
And you do it by what?
Well, there's all different ways to, as you know, I write nonfiction narrative. I know how to tell a story. That's how I think about it. I think of the piece of criticism as a kind of story of how I reacted to this piece. But you have to start in a snappy way. If they don't like the first sentence, they're not going to get to the second sentence. And that's as true as critical writing as any other kind.
And why is it that stories are so damn captivating for us?
Well, we're a species that exists through narrative. That's all I can say. We process.
Yeah, I've heard that, though. I hear that all the time, but why does it keep our attention?
We have to experience our life as a narrative, because otherwise we feel it won't have meaning. That's why we respond to stories. If everything is just a random series of events, that's a kind of terrifying prospect.
So we're always looking for meaning, and that's what you're capitalizing on.
Well, I think so. I mean, I think we're meaning creatures. I think that's part of what we do, and that
we're mean and meaning.
Mean and meaning, and that narrative is a delivery device for meaning.
Okay. And so it's the ultimate question, right? It's like we're standing and sitting on a globe that's spinning around at some high speed, going through some kind of weird place. It's just the most bizarre situation that we're in.
Yeah.
It's bizarre.
That's all we've got to deal with, So
So you're trying to help people understand why that's happening.
Well, it's one of the things. I mean, one of
narratives.
the things you do as a critic is think about narrative and how it works. And if narrative
Right.
is that important for life, then it's an important job.
I was just going to end with why do you do what you do, and why does it matter?
Well, it's what I love to do. It's what I've always been interested in doing, and I think it's important, particularly now when what I call the power of the bandwagon has never been greater. I think it's that much more important to have people. I was just being interviewed actually about my review of A Little Life by someone who's writing a profile of the author, and I said, that was a kind of sweeping, overwhelming book, and I could see why people got excited about it. But I said, the critic's job is to think coolly about things, to separate himself from the immediate emotional excitement. And I think that's more important now than any time before, because we live in a firestorm of instantaneous reactions all the time in our daily lives. And so I think criticism is really, really important.
Just finally, a quick quote again from Clive James on Edmund Wilson. He said that remembering is one of the many duties of the literary chronicles they perform. Not so spectacular a duty as discovering, but equally important. For Wilson's self-imposed task of circulating opinions within an intelligent community, a community which depends on such a process for its whole existence, all these duties needed to be scrupulously carried out. And it is the triumph of the literary chronicles that they were carried out in so adventurous a way. And I guess if we don't have an intelligent community, then we're in big trouble.
Right, exactly. But I do think that thing about memory is very important. I mean, that's part of the service that the critic does for the reader. It's not just enough to have a strong or even interesting opinion. Your job is to do the homework, to know the history of the thing, to know the context, that's part of what you're supplying. That maybe the ordinary reader doesn't have time to do all that research. That's what you're doing for them. But a kind of institutional memory is part of what you're responsible to as a critic, and the institution is literature.
Well, thank you very much for doing me the service of appearing. You're not appearing, to me you are, on the
pleasure,
podcast.
Michael. Absolutely. It's been a pleasure, and I'm glad it worked out. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.